Be late though.
Hello?
Hey. Hear me?
They're coming.
Look.
Here they come. Oh, I'm gonna mute myself.
Lisa, you want me to kick it off and just,
If you like, yeah.
okay. I am a little worried if we start early that people will come late.
We're not going to start early. It is
Okay.
14:57. We just opened the room so they can actually get in.
14:57 military time.
It's how the Europeans do it. Hello, everybody. We're waiting for a few minutes to allow everyone in. It's not yet 3 anyway, so.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is the third session of the Community Development Administration's capacity building seminars for developers who are interested in applying for housing assistance funds from CDA. And today we'll be going over the architectural design standards and the environmental review process. My name is Bill Rata. I'm the Director of Housing here at CDA. And we have various staff that will be available as well. We have Lisa Seligman, Nancy Holman, Pam Olivier, Kiara Boykins, Christy Robinson, and Irv Hamilton. And I think we'll just go ahead and get started right away. And I will turn it over to Lisa and Nancy.
Yeah, actually, hang on half a second here. My pet has decided to be a nuisance. I'm presenting from the house today. And which seems a good way to talk about residential architectural design standards and environmental review, which is a very important topic for our new developers to understand, because designing for CDA housing is a little different. So as an overview, there are several different standards that a CDA project needs to meet, a CDA funded project needs to meet. There are architectural design standards, there are energy conservation standards, environmental review is an important topic, and there are also CRO and Section 106 requirements, which most people just call historic. CDA has developed a guidebook to our design standards, which you can find on our NOFA website. These standards and guidelines basically put most of the commonly needed information regarding a variety of different standards in one place to make it a little easier for you and your designers to design our housing. This combines HUD's minimum property standards, some aspects of the Fair Housing Act, International Building Code and International Residential Code as adopted by the City of St. Louis, which is a little different than the model codes. Energy regulations, we typically do Energy Star, but if you are doing a larger project, you might choose to use Green Communities or LEED or some other standard. And then Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act and the Secretary of the Interior standards for historic properties. Obviously, there are a lot of things that have to be considered in doing one of our projects. So we do require that you have a registered design professional, usually an architect, involved with the project to manage all of these different standards and get them to work out. And you see here, this is an actual CDA project. Part of the reason we require a registered design professional is because the city requires one on condemned buildings, which most of our existing buildings are. This structure had some serious issues, as you can see, had lost part of the back wall, but was beautifully restored as part of a CDA funded project. So, HUD requirements. Accessibility is an issue to the extent that the Fair Housing Act requires it. So if you're doing a multi-unit development, if you're building 5 or more new houses, one of them needs to be accessible. If you're working on a multifamily project that was put into service after 1991, if you have more than 4 units, you have to work with accessibilities, or if you're doing a historic rehab that has more than 15 units. That said, we encourage everyone to think about these issues because all of us are going to need an accessible unit at some point in our lives, whether it's because we break a leg or an ankle out running, which a good friend of mine did, or we have an elder move into our house, which numerous people have had, or we become incapacitated with age ourselves. And so designing with aging in place in mind, putting in blocking for grab bars where they're required, trying not to have a lot of steps, putting in wider doors, this is a great way to design, whether you're specifically designing accessible housing or not. Senior housing has additional requirements as well. HUD also requires us to do lead abatement in projects funded with their money and to have an energy efficiency standard, which we will talk more about in a moment. Okay, design requirements. So first of all, site design. We do need to have at least 1 off-street parking space per unit. That's the zoning code. We like to see more because people like to have more. You need to maintain or restore any historic retaining walls, steps, fences, etc. It's not very common at this point for properties to have an existing fence, but one of our projects actually does. You need to have in your budget to replace damaged or missing public sidewalk. Sometimes you can get money from your alderman with the 50-50 program to do that, but you need to budget for doing the full thing to start with. You need to think about fences and sidewalks within the site. We require some landscaping so that the house looks like a part of the neighborhood from the beginning. Street trees, which you'll work with the forestry department on. We really encourage you to try to work with native plants because they will require the least overall maintenance for our future homeowners or future rental housing owners. And to think about using the MSD rainscaping grants to help fund development of your site where it's possible. The photo here actually shows a house that received a rainscaping grant, and you can see that they have permeable sidewalks made of bricks so the water can go through them and not just run off. And all of these plants are water-loving plants that really perk up when it rains. The botanical gardens can also help you with some resources for this. Okay, key issues you need to think about in developing your site. It needs to be historically appropriate at street visible sides. It needs to be easy to maintain. It needs to be beautiful, right? And you need to try to design it to help decrease runoff to the extent that you can. Building exteriors we'll talk about a little bit more in a little bit. But just to say, rehabs and additions have to meet Section 106 requirements. You do have to use CRO approved windows for street visible elevations. And we do require new roofs on all CDA funded projects. So it just makes it easier for all of us. This is a little project down on Grace that this is an addition for, and I'm sure that'll get talked about a little bit more later. In terms of floor plans, what we're looking for in a floor plan is we're looking for efficient use of circulation space. We're looking for adequate room sizes, especially bedrooms and such. One of the commonly seen issues is there not being enough room for a bed in the bedroom. So really make sure that your designers plan for that. Because it's important.
Lisa, I have a quick question.
Yes.
Is off-street parking an issue if that's not in place? Would the project be eliminated if there's no off-street parking?
You know, we wouldn't automatically eliminate it from consideration. I think the question would be, why is there no off-street parking? Is the site constrained in a way that makes it, you know, is the site too small? Is it a half lot that has another building at the back that can't be demolished? You know, why is there no off-street parking? That's part one. But as a practical matter, it is required by zoning, and it does affect the building's property value if there isn't off-street parking. So we really do want to see at least one space. Sometimes it's not possible, but there have to be good reasons.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. So back to room sizes and relationships. Really think about how furniture lays out in the rooms, how people would actually use the spaces. It's very important. Think about privacy and appropriate placement of storage. So for example, you know, up here, there's linen storage in the bathroom because that's where you want it, right? Every bedroom has a closet. There's storage in the kitchen for a pantry. There's a coat closet. All of these normal things that we expect to have these plans show. At this point, we really prefer to see the laundry near the bedrooms instead of in the basement. Sometimes that's not possible because the house is so small, but a lot of times it works out. And also you really need to consider the existing architectural features in a house. If there's existing millwork, if there's existing fireplaces, those things need to stay in place. And we'll talk more about that when we talk about Section 106 guidelines. Other requirements that we have are new sewer laterals, new water service, and a new 200 amp electrical service. This is just standard in the housing industry now, and it makes sure that your homeowner will have minimal maintenance costs in the future. Energy requirements are also about maintaining housing affordability. I actually went back through and recalculated this morning, and it was shocking to see that electricity prices have increased 56% over the last 20 years, while the average wage increase has been something in the range of 39%. And really, for most people, I don't think it's been 39%. So reducing energy cost is critical to housing affordability. Luckily, at this point, not only do we have the Energy Star program, but most of the requirements for Energy Star are integrated into the 2018 Energy Code that is enforced by the city. This is a performance-based code. Yes, it does say how much insulation you need, but there are trade-offs that can be taken if you need to have historic windows or if there are other things that need to happen. The key to making those trade-offs in an efficient way is to make sure that you get your HERS certified energy rater, and there are several of them in town. Get them involved early. Get them involved at the schematic design level so that they can help your designer make those decisions early. These are just some of the different energy requirements. Obviously, you need Energy Star appliances. You need a minimum of 90% high efficacy lighting, that's LEDs. You need to have insulation in the cavities. The most common issues that we have in the energy requirements are air sealing. Here I've got a photograph of a project that's under construction, and you can see how it's all taped, how the Tyvek is all taped very carefully, and how the flashing on the windows comes out from under the windows so that everything is sealed. That's one of the most common issues, is that things are not sealed properly. Basement insulation is a huge issue. There's lots of ways to do that, but you have to do it. Another issue is HVAC equipment. Typically around here, contractors will still do things by going, oh, well, this is a so many square foot house. This needs so many tons of air conditioning. Make sure they actually calculate it based upon how much insulation the house has and how tight the house is, because what we're finding is that a lot of times these days, these tighter, more insulated houses require significantly less tons of air conditioning, which is not only more energy efficient for your homeowner, but it is also less expensive up front. Another issue we see a lot is duct sealing. They're getting better at this, but making sure that everything is sealed and insulated properly is critical. And then proper insulation installation. Bad insulation, for example, should not be squished into the cavities. It should still be fluffy. It's a very common issue. If you need to learn about some of these things, Ameren runs some free energy training for developers and designers and anybody who's curious about it. And they run these constantly. There's basically about one a month, and they're really good. They don't talk over your head, but they also don't talk down to you. They They assume that you don't know everything and that you need to learn things. It's a really great list of things. Okay. So are we doing okay on questions there, Pam?
Yes, we are.
Okay, cool. I feel like I'm flying through this.
Oh, you're doing good.
Okay, good. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how we go through the design review process with you as you're working through a CDA project. We have an entire process. And one of the critical pieces of this process is the design review meeting, in which I sit down with our CRO, Section 106 reviewer, the lovely and brilliant Jan Cameron, who has joined us. Wave at us, Jan. But at any rate, she and I sit down and we review the drawings together, figure out what needs to happen to go to the next step, what changes need to be made, and we roll from there. It all starts in schematic design. Okay, so schematic design, you'll have preliminary drawings, you'll have a site plan, you'll have plans, you'll have elevations. There's a whole list of what we're looking for in the design guidelines on page 4. The site plan that is part of this package also starts the environmental review process. So that's really where we start moving forward with your project. So we take your schematic design, Jan and I sit down and we talk about it. We generate a list of questions or things that need to be addressed in the design. And 95% of the time, it goes to this step, which is design development, which is the normal next step for your designer anyway, is to take the schematic design and put more detail in it and more thought and make changes. And so they do the design development. What we're looking for in design development is on pages 4 and 5 of the design guidelines, but I'll get to that in a second. And then we go to design review meeting again. Same process, we review it again, where the comments addressed, what do we expect to see in the construction documents that maybe we need to make sure they're aware of. We say, hey, let's see your construction documents. What we expect for that is on pages 5 and 6 of the design guidelines. We do it again. We review the construction documents, make sure that everything that we need to see there to know that your project is going to meet the CDA standards and the Section 106 standards is there. And I'm just going to tell you, each one of these design review meetings, sometimes we'll say, yeah, go on to construction documents. And sometimes we'll say, oh, hey, you're missing this. So we might send you back here and say, hey, we need this, this, and this before we can approve it for the next step. And then when you get that to us, we'll say, okay, finally, you're ready to go. We've been electronic up to this point, but finally we're ready to go, and you need to bring us your permit sets so we can stamp them and give them back to you to take to the building division for permits. Okay, and that's a critical part. What our stamping those permit sets for you does is it tells the building division that they don't need to send it to CRO to be reviewed, and it tells your plan reviewer that you've already been through a pretty rigorous process that addresses a lot of the code requirements. And one of the plan reviewers actually told me that he has kind of an abbreviated checklist that he uses for things that he knows have come through our process. So it expedites your process to make sure you don't skip that step. You go to the building division, you get your permits, and you go forward. So let's look at what each one of those things looks like. Schematic design review. Now this part can start before NOFA submission, because we need to understand what you're going to do in the NOFA to be able to look at your project. We like drawings. Drawings make it very easy to understand. There was a famous architect who said that drawings make it harder to lie. And that's really true. We can see your drawings. We can see what you intend to do. It's easy to understand. And it's also easy for contractors to bid, which is a very important part of the process. However, we do understand that coming into NOFA, you don't necessarily want to invest the money to get an architect or designer to do that at that stage. So the alternate approaches are to, you know, take photos of your existing building and give us notes indicating what work you plan to do. But they're going to be pretty detailed. Okay. You might sketch out a floor plan. It's harder than it looks, but there are tools that make it easier these days. If you're working with a model plan, that there are several local architects who have model plans that we work with. You can sketch the siding and parking and everything over a plat map from Geo St. Louis. But I'm going to tell you, you're going to get the best results, both from us understanding what you're doing and from a contractor understanding for pricing, if you have at least, you know, nominal professional drawings. And they don't have to be fancy. Like this is a pretty typical schematic design presentation. It has a representation of what the building's going to look like on the front elevation. And it has some very simple floor plans that show us how things are going to lay out. This was an existing building. Another thing that's useful for schematic design review, at the NOFA stage, a site plan helps us understand how the building relates to its neighbors. After the NOFA, once you're actually a recipient of a funding reservation, the site plan is critical to us understanding how your house fits and how your site planning fits within the neighborhood. And it's very hard for us to give you a good Section 106 review without one. And it's also hard for me to know that you've got all the stuff that you have to have in the backyard. So this is a good example of a site plan because it shows us where the property line is. It shows us the improvements in the backyard. It shows us how the house lines up with the neighbors, and it shows us the porch on the front. Design development takes it further. You can see more detail in these plans than the last ones. Usually we'll start to see more elevations. So the second sheet of this set had the other 3 elevations on it. And those have more notes telling us what things are. More detail. Finally, your permit documents, that's what we call plans or blueprints. They're the full set of drawings for permits and constructions. They have everything that we need to make sure that you meet the codes and the standards, and they have what your contractor needs to bid the project and build the project accurately. At this stage, they will be full-size hard copies. Everything up to this we can do electronically as long as the drawings are scalable. When you're giving us, when you get to this stage, make sure that you have all of our comments addressed. Usually it's a good idea to draw attention to them in a cover letter. On the offhand chance that you are using tax credits to help fund your project, which as Nancy stated, is hard to do with a small project anymore, with a single family project anymore. If you're getting tax credits though, we have to have the approval letter for SHPO before we can approve. And here's that stamp that we put on the drawings that you take to the building department. Permits, you submit those plans that we had in the previous thing. Your mechanical, electrical, and plumbing subs have to pull separate permits. Usually they'll base their work on what's in the drawings and they provide their own drawings for that. MSD permits, usually are a bigger issue for larger projects, but there are some lots that have MSD limitations on them, particularly in North City, that may affect your downspouts, how you do your landscaping, how much hard surface you have, and how your interior sewer stuff works. Some places you're required to have higher laterals than in others. Larger projects tend to be more involved than the small ones in this. Construction. Notice the very first thing there. Make sure your contractor keeps the site clean. Make sure they keep building materials off the sidewalks. We don't want to hear from the aldermen that people are unhappy about a dirty site. Another critical thing is that any design changes during construction, which sometimes happen, this photo I'm showing you here, when we really got into the project, they discovered that the roof structure was completely bad and we had to do an entirely new roof trusses. That's okay, that happens. Make sure you get our design approval first before beginning the work. We do inspect the property in addition to what the city does for code inspection. We check at least at draws, but the reality is that my colleague, Irv Hamilton, is on site usually once a week or so. I usually hit the smaller projects once a month or so. And you will see in new construction, you will see CRO staff out there double checking that the brick ledges are there for new construction, that your windows and doors are appropriate, that the roofs and everything are as they were approved on the drawings. So we do check things. And construction draws get processed as well as part of the instruction. Okay, so that was design review. Let's talk about environmental review. For the entire time that the United States has funded housing in any way, their environmental review has been a part of it because of this goal, to provide a decent, safe home for every American. This has been codified more and more over the years. One of the critical things is from this National Environmental Policy Act, which we call NEPA, in 1969, that states that environmental values shall be given appropriate consideration in decision-making. What does that mean? What that means is that one of the factors we use to judge your NOFA application is the environmental qualities of the project. Okay? We think about this before we make an award, because if the project is not in a good area environmentally, then we can't fund it. But also, we can't even release funds until environmental study is done. And you can't spend any funds on a project that you have applied for until the environmental study is done. Now, this makes sense, right? We don't want to put people, particularly affordable housing, places that are not good environmentally. But we also, as CDA, have an interest in making sure that the study is done properly, because if we don't, the city might have to repay the money. And Dallas got caught in a big issue about this in 2019. We have to consider 14 different things. The ones in orange are the ones that are the biggest things in St. Louis. Some we can't do anything about. Air quality, for example. Our air quality is what it is. For the most part, housing doesn't have a big impact on that. But we can't locate housing where air quality is the worst, which is along our freeways. Okay. So there are really, for the most part, the 4 issues. Let me go back up here. Yeah. The 4 issues that give us the most problems in St. Louis in looking at projects are contamination and toxic substances, explosive and flammable hazards. Historic preservation is something we work with. Noise disqualifies a project on a fairly regular basis, and flood insurance. Now I'm going to kind of show you kind of what to look for in a site, but when you are first evaluating your site for a NOFA, before you do anything else, email me the address and I will check the problem things, because I don't want you to go through the entire process and discover at the last minute that, oh, the noise is too much. So email me first. I'm happy to look, more than happy to look. So here are the things that are problems. Noise is the #1 thing that disqualifies our projects. And I'm showing you here the actual HUD calculator. Okay. The closer the site is to a major road, the more noise there is. We have a website that we go to that the Missouri Department of Transportation has, that shows us how many cars go on every road. And we have to calculate that. Okay. So we put that in. The more cars, the more noise. The steeper the road, the more noise. Faster roads are more noise. Active railroad tracks also get added in. The biggest problem areas for that are way south and along the Mill Creek Valley. You can see a little bit more. This is that MoDOT website that shows the roads and shows the amount of traffic. Generally speaking, stay 1,000 feet away from freeways if you can. Be aware of busy streets in the vicinity. Jefferson, Cass, Arsenal. We just did a calculation on a project that is near the intersection of Jefferson, Gravois, and it's on Pestalozzi, and it was very nearly disqualified because of noise. So keep in mind, absolutely email me so that I can calculate it, so we know whether that's a good site. There are very few sites in St. Louis where we have to think about airport noise, but you see that blue line? That's the center line of the runway. And we do have some airport noise issues along that line. For the most part, those sites are too close to I-70 to qualify, but just keep it in mind. Floodplain. We can't really fund anything that's in a floodplain. Luckily, there are not a whole lot of properties in St. Louis in floodplains, but there are some. You can look this up on the FEMA flood maps. Pretty easy to check. Once again, I'm happy to do this for you. Explosive hazards. How many of us remember the Praxair explosion 14 years ago? My parents actually lived in Lafayette Square at that time. It was kind of scary. So we have to be mindful of where the project is located in comparison to tanks. Most of our explosive hazards are along the river and the freeways. You can see them on Google Maps. Once again, email us. If it's within a mile of your project, email us so we can check it out. Happy to do it. Don't want you to spend time and money looking at something that you can't do. Toxic substances. Our big problems in St. Louis are old gas stations, which seem to have been on every corner, and dry cleaning, which there seem to be one of those on every corner too. So you can tell this pretty easily. The Gas stations are easy to tell, dry cleaners not so easy. Once again, email me, I'll check it out. Things you can do something about. In an existing building, you have to abate the lead paint. You have to give us a lead abatement plan. You have to have a contractor who has Renovate Right certification. We also require that you test for radon and that a mitigation system is installed, and that mitigation system may not be on the exterior of the building, so we ask that you plan for it in advance. Another environmental issue that we work with is Section 106 review, historic preservation, which applies to beautiful buildings like this one, which is on Clarence Avenue up in North City, and new houses being built in an existing context. And this is where our friend Jan Cameron is going to take over. I'm going to stop sharing, and Jan gets to take over. Pam, are we doing okay on questions?
Yes, they asked for your email, which I've already shared.
Excellent, thank you.
Okay.
Okay, am I unmuted now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh,
Everyone
good.
can.
Okay. Now let me see if I can share my screen here. We should have had a dry run on this, guys. Hang on. Here's my screen. Can you see that? No?
Yes,
Yep, we got it.
Can you see the methodology slide?
yes.
Okay. I think I am a little ahead of myself. Okay. So I'm Jan Cameron. I'm with the Cultural Resources Office, which is the city's, I should go to that slide, the city's historic preservation agency. And we assist the Community Development Agency and some other departments as well in performing the Section 106 review that's required anytime federal money is used to fund a historic a possible historic preservation project. So this is Section 106. What is most important about this is, if you could see the red letters, says that any federal funds that can affect a district site building, structure, or object that is included in or eligible for inclusion in the National Register, we need to assess the project and make sure that any effect it has is taken into consideration. That has resulted in reams of interpretation, but essentially all that the Section 106 review of the National Historic Preservation Act says is this. Note that whether a property is actually listed in the register or is listed as part of a historic district on the National Register, or whether it is only eligible for being so, they are treated exactly the same. So this is my checklist, which is a lot more complicated and colorful than Lisa's was, but essentially, and I'm not going to belabor this point, but the first thing that I want to indicate to you is that our current programmatic agreement with the State Historic Preservation Office allows us to do this review, which ordinarily would have to be submitted to them. However, one of the things it doesn't currently allow us to do is assess archaeological impacts. So if you're doing new construction, you are going to run into archaeology, and I'll talk about that briefly a little bit further. But so the first thing when we receive a referral from CDA or any other agency is to assess whether there is ground disturbance. And if so, we go over to this end and we say we have to notify the Historic Preservation Office and the federal tribes that have decided that the St. Louis region is one of their ancestral homelands. Okay, so there are 5 tribes currently that have asked that. So we always need to keep them informed of projects that have any sort of possibility for ground disturbance. Okay, so then having done that, we go to whether the property is eligible or ineligible for listing on the National Register. That's the salmon colored line here. If it's eligible, then the plans are reviewed by us for compliance with the Secretary of the Interior standards. They comply with the standards, we issue a determination of no adverse effect and issue a final checklist and sign the plans, as Lisa showed you previously. If they don't, then we work with you to try to revise the plans so that we all have the happy effect of no adverse effect. Very occasionally, an adverse effect may have to happen, and that is generally when a demolition of a historic structure is involved. Demolitions are always an adverse effect. At that point, it's still not the end, because Section 106 is not meant to stop projects, but it does require a memorandum of agreement where we negotiate with the State Historic Preservation Office, possibly the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, and any other interested parties, and that could include the tribes as well, to come up with a memorandum of agreement that would specify mitigation or something to make up for the loss of the historic building. Okay. Now, assessing eligibility. The first thing is it individually listed on the National Register, which is a high merit designation? Is it contributing to a district? We have currently about, 20 some historic districts, both locally designated and nationally designated in the city. And then if it is considered to be a eligible building, we look at the property itself to see if it retains its historic character and appearance. This poor little guy, I think is in McKinley Fox, and has been pretty much mucked up as much as it could possibly be. This would not be considered any longer contributing to the district because of all the alterations that have happened and changed its character. If it is intact, is the building of sufficient importance to be listed individually? This doesn't happen very often. 99.9% of the buildings that we work with are contributing to a neighborhood that is either listed or is eligible to be listed on the register. Whether the property is in a cohesive neighborhood is another determination of eligibility. This area over here, you can see, has very few historic resources left. So anything that happens in there is probably not going to be eligible. And I'm sorry to always speak in probabilities, but every case is different. One of the other things that you may not have considered is that modern buildings that were constructed in the post-war era are now eligible for the National Register. This you may recognize as what's now the Starbucks on North Grand. And it is a significant resource in the St. Louis Modern survey that our office completed several years back. So there you may run into what we call a mid-century modern building, and that would be possibly eligible for the National Register, even though it may be younger than me. So the other thing to consider is the historic significance a building may have that is not necessarily attached to its architecture. This building here is, doesn't look very important. It might be contributing as part of the district, but in itself, it would not be individually eligible, except that it is a previous home of Chuck Berry and is listed individually on the National Register for that significance. Now, ineligibility, I talked about that briefly, but loss of historic fabric will imperil the eligibility of an area. That's again, just kind of we don't have hard and fast rules about that. If I would think 40% of the original historic resources were gone, that might imperil the eligibility. It all depends. We look at every site individually and make a determination. The other thing that can affect eligibility are intrusions. This is a lovely building on the north side, but it is surrounded by factories. And so therefore, unless there would be some possibility of this being individually eligible, which is not likely unless it was associated with an important person or event, this would not be eligible. Other things can affect the eligibility of a district, and that is inappropriate infill, such as this little guy here. But a few of those will not imperil the character of an area. So unless it's overwhelmingly new construction, such as this example here, where I think the only historic building is this one and this one, and everything else is new, this would certainly not be eligible. Should I receive a rehabilitation project for this or a new construction project, I would not really have anything to say about it at all. I'd just say it's not eligible. I don't need to even look at it. The integrity of the buildings, that is, those that have been altered, can also have an effect on it. Again, you'd have to have an awful lot of alteration to have that really matter about the eligibility of the district. This building would not be considered contributing anymore, even though it's a nice little second empire, but because of the application of permastone on the front. This building has been altered. It's lost its cornice. It undoubtedly had a cornice similar to this building, but it hasn't been affected enough, so this would remain a contributing element. And this is one of my favorite slides. I love to show this. This is a building in Benton Park, and it was considered non-contributing, but the owner decided they were going to restore it, and this is what it looks like now. And it is, again, a contributing building to the district. Now, once we know whether we have an eligible building, we try to determine the project's effect on it. And also on the effect the project may have on other properties within the neighborhood. So we could have an ineligible building and the project proposed for it would have an adverse effect on the building across the street or the building next door, whatever. That doesn't happen very often, but it is a possibility that we need to consider. In order to make that determination, we use what's known as the Secretary of the Interior Standards for the Treatment of Historic Properties. These are 10 statements of goodwill about how one should preserve a historic building. Again, they have been interpreted by reams of regulations, but primarily for us, there are 4, concerning rehabs, there are 4 of these that are relevant. And one is that the number 2, the historic character of the property will be retained and preserved. And distinctive materials and spaces and relationships that characterize a property will be retained and preserved. Number 5, distinctive materials, finishes, construction materials, or craftsmanship that characterize the property shall be preserved. Number 9, new additions, alterations, or related new construction will not destroy historic materials or the relationships that characterize the property, and the new work will be compatible. So that's what we strive to do, because obviously historic buildings need to be brought into the current day and be able to be useful for current people. So These are briefly the Secretary of the Interior interpretation of Secretary of Interior standards. One is highly significant features should be preserved in place, such as these absolutely wonderful columns. We retain significant elements whenever possible and repair or replicate only when necessary. And non-significant elements may be replaced. So that doesn't mean that you can't replace your windows, but you need to do it appropriately. Applying the Secretary standards. There is something called facade hierarchy, which means that we place more importance on those visible elevations of a building than we do on the less prominent elevations, such as the rear. So more flexibility is allowed to what you can do to the rear than to what you can do to the front. Again, the idea is to replicate and repair if possible, but certainly replicate primary elevations of the front facades. On the left is a beautifully restored house. A similar building over here has had inappropriate windows inserted. The original recessed entry has been closed up with a very contemporary and inappropriate entry door. So this is no, this is what we're shooting for under 106. Windows are a particular issue for a lot of people because, again, as Lisa mentioned, there's a energy efficiency aspect to it. We allowed thermopane windows. There are many historically, well, not historic windows, but they're windows that manufacturers have created specifically to use as appropriate replacements for historic windows. These are original windows. They're single paned, they're arched, and they have their original brick mold. And that is what we're going to replace with appropriate modern windows that will hopefully not change the character of this at all. In addition to having the right windows, and we do, our office has a list, so if you're interested, we can certainly provide you with already approved replacement windows, and we're always looking for more to add to our list. So, but in addition to using the right windows, you need to install them properly. This is a couple of townhouses in Benton Park, and they both have the same replacement windows in them. These have been sized appropriately, and these have not. These are full frame replacements. And that is something that you will need to do on front elevations. That is that you're going to remove the existing window frame so that the glass sizes, and you can see that in this close-up, are not smaller. And so you can see how the difference, just same window, but just the fact that this was inserted within a frame. So now there are two frames in this window. Glass size is smaller, there's a lot more wood around the exterior. And this is a replacement that actually replicates the historic wood window that it replaced. Appropriate methods to remove paint. We recommend that, well, we demand really that bricks never be painted if they're not painted already. If they are painted, you can repaint, but it's not what we would advise. The appropriate thing is to remove paint because the paint sets up an impermeable barrier and traps moisture in the wall. And what it does is it leads certainly to, ultimately to the destruction of the brick. So there are appropriate means to remove existing paint, and that's recommended. It's not required. You can keep previously painted buildings painted. Here's a case in point. However, if you have a painted building and you want to repaint it, it should be repainted appropriately. The center unit, they're all painted, but the center unit was recently painted. And what's happened is, in addition to not being a great thing for the facade, what was originally supposed to be perceived as a single unit now has this very odd center in it. So that would be something that we could not accept under 106, but you could have repainted it the same color. Decorative elements must be retained or replicated if necessary on the exterior. But however, we do allow wrapping of trim on non-visible elevations, such as the back or in a gangway. We try to be flexible as we can. The section 106 requirements do include interiors. The first thing is we, again, just as we have hierarchy of facades, we have hierarchy of interiors as well. If there's no historic fabric, then I really don't have anything to say about the interior, and pretty much anything can go on. However, when there are intact spaces, those that are considered to be public spaces, that is like the entry hall, the living room, the dining room, those areas where the occupant, and that could be an apartment occupant as well as a homeowner, would receive guests. And those areas need to retain any existing trim. You do not need to replace trim that's no longer there, but any existing trim, doors, etc., needs to be retained in the public spaces. This is an example of a very historic stair in a lovely orange and lime color that was restored. We actually had to fight with the building division to allow them to keep the original stair because it, of course, doesn't comply with the original code, our building code today. And that is it in its restored glory. So that's something you need to consider when you're looking at property, that we are going to have requirements on the interior of the major spaces in the building. Private spaces, however, you can pretty much do anything that you like with, and that would be kitchen, bathroom, bedrooms, that kind of thing. Things that would be only for the occupant and not for reception. I will point out, however, that if you are doing a historic tax credit program, my understanding is that the state office does not observe such a rigid separation between public and private spaces. I just put that on. I could give you more guidance if you decide to pursue that, but at the moment, that seems to be the way they are interpreting the standards. That's not the way the national people are interpreting it, but there you go. The only exception to that would be if there were significant resources within the private spaces, that if that happens, such as the butler's pantry on the left or the mantle on the right, we usually work with you to maybe relocate them into a public space. So perhaps the first floor fireplace doesn't have a mantle. Well, we could move this bedroom mantle down to it. As long as it stayed in the house, that would not be considered an adverse effect. We also look at site improvements, such as contributing outbuildings. Now, those would have to be ones that were built at the same time as the main building on the property, or that had some kind of special character of their own. It would be like a carriage house here. There wouldn't probably be too many other examples of that. We would want to preserve any historic retaining walls and any historic fences. We don't want this to happen, however. I want to emphasize that the terraces that you see on many of our blocks are artificial and were put specifically there as part of the design of the block and the neighborhood. And those need to be retained under 106. This is a particularly awful example. But this is another example where you can see how this retaining wall has interrupted the consistent, beautiful slope of the terrace. So that would be something you could not do under 106. You could do a curbing down at the bottom if there was some kind of runoff problem, but not a retaining wall that substantially changed the slope of the yard. Fences ordinarily we don't care about. They're not considered to be permanent structures. And retaining walls that are not visible from the street are also something that we wouldn't really worry about. Same thing for new carports or garages. As long as they are not dominating the main house, we don't really have much review over it. And then finally, modern elements should not be visible. So we hide them on the roof or in the backyard. We don't do something like this, which is, was a nice southern sloping roof to put some solar panels on it. Solar panels are allowed on non-visible roof slopes, and also, of course, on garages or sometimes on other structures in the back, but not on a visible part of the house. Similar to these kinds of elements, this is a lovely turret that has Dish Network all over it. And also utilities need to come in a non-visible location. This is a horrible mistake that happened in Lafayette Square a few years back, where all of the services came in the front. And that is not something that we can accept under 106. Okay, new construction. First, additions to historic buildings. Again, we go back to the Secretary of the Interior Standards. And this time we're looking at number 9, which says new additions, alterations, or related new construction will not destroy historic materials, features, or the relationships that characterize the property. This is one of the best appropriate additions to a historic structure that's been done in the last few years. This is Rosati Kane on Lindell. And you can see that they put a very substantial addition on it, but it is very obvious that this is the historic and important building. This is something added to it. It's set back so that this maintains its prominence, uses the same matching brick and some of the same colors, but it's a simplified design. It's obviously a contemporary building. And this is what we try to achieve with additions to historic buildings. This is not what we try to achieve. When I was putting slides together, I found this. This happened maybe 20 years ago in Benton Park, where someone thought it was a good idea to put a ranch on top of an Italianate house. But anyway, that is what we're working against. So this is 5010 Grace, which Lisa spoke of a little bit ago. And the idea was that we wanted to rehabilitate this house as a single family. You can see that it's all a very small scale neighborhood. It is eligible for the National Register. But these are all little shotguns. That is that they're like one room after another. So it's very difficult to think about how we would put an addition onto it. And the way we did it was we added another house next to it and we connected them with a hyphen, little hallway here. And what that does is, you can see again that this is totally contemporary looking. We know it's not fakely historic. It maintains the small scale of the neighborhood, and yet it allows this house to be reused with enough bedrooms for a family. So that I think was a very successful project. Now, new construction in general for a new house, we want number 10 of the standards, which say new additions will be undertaken in a manner that it could be removed if in the future. Well, that relates to not to new construction houses exactly, but the essential form and integrity of this historic environment will be retained. And that's what we work very hard to do on new construction when we're inserting a new building in a historic neighborhood. So new buildings should be comparable to the adjacent historic buildings in height, mass, scale, floor to ceiling heights, setbacks, and of course, exterior materials. Siding, this is Lafayette Square because it wasn't a planned development. Many people bought side yards because they wanted a larger yard. And what's happened is what was meant to be a very consistent streetscape has become sort of non-consistent. And while the houses are very beautiful and they reflect the historic character of the neighborhood, this is the opposite block. These are opposites. So obviously this is not a successful 106 project. It wasn't a 106 project, actually. It was just a neighborhood project. But that is something that we try to consider, that we try to maintain what they call the rhythm of the block, the buildings and space, buildings and space. And so many times we ask that new construction not be sited in the center of a large parcel, but more to the side, so that it appears to be more cohesive with the development of the block originally. Scale and mass. This is an example of a really wrong scale and mass. What we want to do is have the new building, while being new looking, fit into the character of the block. The best thing that I've seen, the most successful I've seen on that has been this development that's along Bates in Carondelet by Habitat for Humanity. This is the existing context, and these are the buildings that were constructed. So I think you can see how well these fit in, despite the gangways are a little wider, but that's because it's a required dimension by zoning right now. You can't build, and maybe don't want to build the way they did historically. But if you drive down the street, you see how well this fits in perfectly with the neighborhood. It doesn't seem to be anything out of the ordinary. And yet the details of these houses are contemporary and not fakely historic. Oh, sorry, that was compatibility in new construction that I zipped right through. Some of our historic districts require model examples. That's Lafayette Square for one, that we just spoke of previously. They require a model example, meaning you have to base your new building on a historic building. This is not accepted preservation practice. However, as I said, some of the districts do require it. And this model example was used as a justification to construct this building. So I would say that many people would look at this and not realize that it's not historic. And that is one of the things that we try to avoid in approving new construction. Well, what is appropriate is to look at the neighborhood and think about the elements of it and how to fit that into a contemporary design. These are in Soulard and I think are very successful. They're obviously not historic, but they fit in beautifully with the small scale character and the brick quality of Soulard. This is not from St. Louis, but I threw this in because it's very interesting. This is a new building that's been inserted into a very elaborate block of commercial buildings. And actually, this is the wall of the building. What you're seeing here is actually a metal screen. So it's a very edgy kind of response to fitting a new building into a historic context. This is in the same city, actually, and is a less successful example. This is an area of like Queen Anne frame buildings, and this is a proposal. So this is a little bit too disruptive, or as I put in a more politically correct, differentiated. This example is from St. Louis. This is in the Central West End, where the property owner bought a building from a developer without any sort of thought about how to fit it in with the neighborhood. Or so this building is just so totally out of character for the neighborhood in scale, in siding as it faces a different direction from the rest of the street, and in massing, that it's an unfortunate example. And even though it is mostly brick, the brick is not correct either, because it's a modeled variegated bond. So that was unfortunate. But if you're going to build a new house, very likely you're going to need to use brick on at least some of it. If there are certain historic frame buildings, sided buildings in the vicinity, you may be able to come up with a sided building, and you'll see one in the next slide. But this particular property, nowhere in sight is there anything but brick. So this site, development site, which is right here, would have to have brick on all the visible elevations, not the rear, but visible elevations. And this is the building, and it does have a full brick wall here, which unfortunately I didn't have a photo of. However, this is not how it originally appeared when it was built. It looked like that. And they bought the entirely wrong brick. So we ended up having to stain this so that, and it actually turned out very nicely. But so it's not just that your building needs to be brick, but it needs to be the right kind of brick, of a consistent color and of a similar shade to other buildings in the vicinity. And my final example is 3535 Missouri. I think you can see a little green flounder house here. Flounders are one of the property types St. Louis is known for. It's a little half house. Maybe you have possibly heard it called that. It's about shaped like that. So it has one slope of roof and a flat blind wall on the property line. So this is a very precious building. It was built probably, it was built in two sections actually, and the first one being about 1850. So the proposal was to build two new single families on these two parcels. And there is substantial frames buildings in the area. So the idea was we would do a flounder, but a modern flounder. And here they are. And here's what the building looks like now, the historic building. And again, these are not obviously historic buildings. You can see that let me pull this up here. You can see by all of the details, they're all contemporary. The windows are very flat. There's a difference in siding on the front to the back. You know, it has a contemporary flair, but it still fits in with the neighborhood, and it makes a little nod to this wonderful building, which hopefully is going to be restored. At least has a property owner. And very finally, very quickly, archaeology. I spoke about it when you have major ground disturbance. If you're going to have a new building, you're going to have major ground disturbance. There's no getting away from it. Major ground disturbance is considered to be any excavation deeper than 12 inches below grade. Any new excavation. If you are putting a new porch in and it's in the same footprint as an existing porch, that's not ground disturbed because that ground has already been disturbed. But any new construction will require archaeological attention. Now, right now, CDA is supplying, I think, most of that, and Lisa can correct me if I'm wrong about that. But the first step is that an archival review is produced. And this is just a sample of what is usually a 70 to 90 page document that explores the prehistory and history of the site, who lived there. It shows it located on various historic maps. This is the Compton Dry Atlas. And then it locates every other instance of archaeology or historic evaluations in the vicinity. So it's very substantial. We send that to the SHPO and to the tribes that I spoke of earlier. And generally so far, we have not had any sort of particular requirement for further archaeological research. However, we have one coming up that was identified as being the site of a previous historic cemetery. And so that one is going to require a little bit more attention, but generally the archival review is sufficient. And as I said, CDA does that. It may be at some point that there'll be required field walking where an archaeologist is contracted to go up and walk the site to see if they can identify any features that might indicate that there could be resources there. What will probably happen with the cemetery site is that monitoring during excavation will be required. So an archaeologist will be on site and will watch the digger and make sure that no artifacts or any human remains are turned up on it. I just wanted to mention that because it should be included in your time frame for your project, because it does take some time to get responses from the state and from the tribes. So I think that's it. This is me. My contact, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
And just to reiterate, we do help with the archaeological process. When you give us that site plan as your first schematic design object, after you've been awarded a funding reservation, we send that directly, if there is ground disturbance shown on it, which usually is pretty easy to tell. Building a carport, that's ground disturbance. You know, really, it's usually pretty easy to tell. Then we hand it off to the archaeologist. The archaeologist writes the archival review, which we then hand to Jan, and we start the process with SHPO. In general, that process in and of itself is a 60 to 90 day process at minimum.
Yeah.
So just figure for it. We do have a question.
Mhm.
Previously developed vacant sites need archaeology. Yeah. Yes. They
Yes.
do.
And it's not just prehistoric archaeology that they're concerned about. They're also concerned about historic architecture or archaeology. So that would be, you know, culvert or the cistern or anything that might give them some indication of the history of the people that lived on the site. So,
Yeah, for example, one of the large projects we're working on in North St. Louis right now has had an archaeologist on site through all of the excavation. And they've been excavating for over a year now, and they'll be excavating for maybe another 2 weeks. But the archaeologist has been on site for that entire time. And what they've found has been mostly what we call historic archaeology. So it's stuff that has happened since we know Westerners have been in the area. You know, there have been a couple of cisterns, and people threw trash in cisterns when they abandoned them. And there have been some old sewers and other such things that have been thoroughly documented by the archaeologist. That is a big project. And that's where we've been seeing more of that than on the little ones. But we do have our first one that's going to require our first single family residence that will require that attention coming up. Just budget time for it. Okay, do we have other questions or concerns? Oh, do we have another question? Open, done. Okay. Anyone
Lisa-
else?
Hey, Lisa, I would also add to that. Please, if you have been awarded a funding reservation, please don't bug your housing analyst about the length of time that is taking, or complain about the length of time, because that is something that we as housing analysts can't control. That is up to the response time of the state and of the tribes. So we understand, but complaining about it to us is not probably going to help.
Yeah, there's nothing any of us can do about the amount of time that it takes. We do everything as quickly as we can, but it just, like I said, just budget 60 to 90 days. I would say just budget 90 days for that process and know that's going to happen. And while that is happening, you can be working through the rest of your design review. We're doing that right now. Jan and I review we review the architecture for your project while SHPO's reviewing the archaeology, so that when we get that stuff back from the state, hopefully we're done. Hopefully. Any other questions? Okay, my email address was put in the chat earlier, but will be available on site on the website when we post the slides. And that is all we have for today. Thank y'all. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.